Welcome to the webinar Enhancing Food Security and Access to Clean Water through Space Technology, along with an overview of the Dutch landscape in space applications. This is the second webinar in a series of webinars in advance of the 6th edition of the CASSINI Hackathon that is organized in the Netherlands by dotSPACE and Royal Haskoning. Before we move to introduce today's speakers, I would like to present a few logistical points at first, and of course, then the agenda for today. Thank you all for joining us, and especially to our speakers, Kees van Duijvendijk from NSO, the Netherlands Space Office, and Marie Schellens from PAX, to all the participants. As you may have noticed, you are automatically muted and you don't have video when you join the call. Whenever you have a question or you would like to share something, please put it in the Q&A box. After each speaker, we will have the chance to address your questions. And of course, then you will also have the opportunity to raise your hand and we can unmute you. And if you would like, we can also share your video so we can have a more direct interaction. We're going to take the first hour almost of the webinar to hear from our two speakers. Before that, a short introduction to the CASSINI Hackathon. And after our speakers, a short presentation of the CASSINI Entrepreneurship. In the meantime, as I said, anything you would like to ask, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. And excuse my voice at the same time because we are going through the change of seasons and that's the traditional call that I have got. Without further ado, let me start by sharing my screen and presenting you the agenda for this afternoon. As I said, we will be starting with a short introduction to the CASSINI Hackathon, followed by our second keynote speakers with questions and answers. For those of you that have attended the previous webinar, maybe this is already familiar information, but also a chance to refresh your memory. This is a presentation of the 6th edition of the CASSINI Hackathon taking place early November from the 3rd to the 5th in various areas around Europe. There are 10 local organizers this time around, and in the Netherlands, as I mentioned, it's organized by dotSPACE and Royal Haskoning. The CASSINI Hackathon is an initiative promoted by USPA, the EU agency for the space program, and it's implemented by Space Tech Partners and Verheerd. The purpose is to create innovative solutions to come up with ideas to use space data in specific settings. This year's topic is the use of space for international development and humanitarian aid, which is, of course, a broad range topic, encompassing things such as infrastructure, forced migration, what we are discussing today, food security and clean water. And this broad topic is split into 3 specific challenges that hackathon participants are going to address. We have organized the series started last week and going on through next week on webinars that are associated to each of these challenges. So last week we addressed the first challenge, sustainable infrastructure development. This week we are addressing access to clean water and food security. And for those of you who would be interested in attending and registering, next week we're going to address the topic of the third challenge, that is forced migration, its forecasting and understanding. The dates are also mentioned here. If you have not yet registered and are interested to do so, you have almost 2 weeks left until the 26th of October. At the end of this session, we'll have an opportunity for networking and matchmaking, which would allow you to find a team if you have not already done so and are still interested in participating. If you still have troubles finding your dream team, you can, of course, always reach out to us. Specifically, this webinar this week is taking place in the framework of the Big Ideas campaign, which is a campaign that's running through all the local organizers, and it's aiming to provide more information about the use of space data and space applications for the topic of this year's hackathon. If you have attended perhaps yesterday's launch event, you will know more about it. But there are more events happening this week on central level. I have put here the dates. If you quickly Google Big Ideas Campaign Cassini, you will find the links to all that. And for the one that's taking place today at 5, you still have the chance to register. If you would like to register, before I move, for the CASSINI Hackathon in the Netherlands, you should also know that it's taking place in Amersfoort from the 3rd to the 5th of November. Accommodation, meals, and technical support for the teams is already provided for. The winners have the chance to modest monetary prize, and of course, the big prize that is a 6 months expert mentoring program. You can register to participate in person ideally, but also hybrid if you live in a remote area or even abroad and you do not have a local organizer. And this is the QR that you can use to scan and be taken to the registration page. While I'm doing that, perhaps I would invite our first keynote speaker, Kees van Duijvendijk, Advisor Satellite Applications at the Netherlands Space Office, NSO, to share their screen. I believe I have to stop sharing my screen before you will be able to do that. You will have about 10 minutes to present to us the work of NSO in the field of food security and primarily access to clean water. So without further ado, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. I'll briefly explain the work we've been doing at the G4W program in the past 10 years. My name is Kees van Duijvendijk. I work with the Netherlands Space Office. Briefly about the Netherlands Space Office, we are the Dutch space agency. We have different goals, which are to strengthen the space sector and, of course, the international trade. Also to focus on sustainable development goals, and mainly to promote the use of satellite data inside and outside of the Netherlands. And of course, space also is always used for inspiration of the youth, inspiration of many things. And at this moment, we're mainly focusing on the long-term agenda for space, because in the past many years, we always had we focus on the next few years, and now we're actually making a long-term strategy to see how we can use space for the next 10, 15 years. The G4AW program, it's already 10 years old. That doesn't seem like a long time, but you need to realize that 10 years ago, the first Sentinel was not even launched. So we were a program promoting satellite data before the main open satellite data was available in the Sentinel program. It's funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's the idea is to create digital advisory services for smallholders based on the use of satellite data. The objectives were quite bold. It was to reach 4.5 million farmers, reduce inputs, increase production, and also increase income. Although the latter three objectives were kind of an and/or statement. So the main focus was on increasing production and food security, and ideally also doing so by reducing the use of inputs and increasing the efficiency of water as well. The idea was to create a business model, to create different services that farmers can use to change their actions towards more productivity, more sustainability. And when you look at the kind of services that are created, it's mainly weather forecasting, improved weather forecasting, creating crop calendars, yield forecasting, disease warning, also drought and flood warning, although this is quite a specific case because it's often a public service and not a private service. Index insurance and also risk profiling to help farmers get more access to loans. We also asked the different projects. In the end, there were 25 projects in 15 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia. Half were in Southeast Asia and the other half in Africa. We asked the projects what were the services that were most used. And around the third said, okay, it's mainly weather information. The rest is interesting. But when we talk to farmers, what they really need, what they really use is mainly weather information and also quite basic crop management advice. So the more complex kind of development, so the real precision agriculture, fertilizer advice, crop yield forecasting, they have been found very relevant, but mainly by the companies involved and not necessarily by the smallholders themselves. I think one of the main critiques we often get is that digital services, they cannot reach the bottom of the pyramid. So you reach the farmers that are stepping out from smallholders towards commercial, and the assumption is always that you cannot reach the bottom. I think this is one of the examples that shows that we can reach the pastoralists, which are in the Sahel, which are pretty much considered the bottom of the pyramid. We can provide them with useful advice on finding fresh water, fresh biomass, find the access to to markets, and also compare the market prices at different markets, so they can make well-informed decisions on which routes to take their livestock with, and especially also avoid conflicts with the normal farmers, the agricultural farmers, because that's the main cause of conflicts in these regions. They can simply use a smartphone, a basic phone, to reach out to a call center where they have the more advanced program software, and they can provide farmers with advice. So these have been scaled to Burkina, Mali, and Niger, and they're still being picked up in the region. Another one is the drought insurance, which is one of the most obvious services you can create, because this is one of the few examples where a business model can be linked with increasing productivity and climate change adaptation. Farmers can, are enabled to take, for example, the risk to cultivate a third crop. Normally, farmers might cultivate like two crops every year, but if you provide them to insurance, they might be willing to take a risk, and by that, producing more food in a year. It's quite a basic service from the Earth observation perspective, based on the differences in a certain indicator, either evaporation, NDVI, soil moisture, whatever, compared to a certain baseline, helping farmers in getting easier access to payouts. This has been quite commercially scaled towards different countries. Another one shows the evaluation over time. So we started with single focused projects. So we started with weather forecast, with good agricultural practices. And in the last round, there have been 3 rounds, people started to realize that it's not about a single advice, but it's about a bundle of advice. So the one of the latter projects in Ghana provided farmers with not only the market information, the location of the plantations, but also with access to loans, weather information, and some more complex economic advice, such as pest and disease warning, which is in a way a complete bundle from the advice perspective, but also from the service delivery perspective, by using call centers and also voice messages. And something quite different, but also funded by the same ministry, is the WAPOR dataset, the water productivity portal, that is now part of the FAO, and I think in the future of Copernicus. That is a link between, it's the conversion between satellite data and something that is more actionable. So it converts different sensors into something that says something about the productivity of water, evaporation, and that can be quite, well, not easily, but this can be quite relevant for water boards to understand the over extraction of water, for farmers to maybe see when to irrigate. And that's like a step between making data available and creating projects. You can also simply create public data, or data as public goods, to facilitate business models at a later stage. Challenges, normally I'm very optimistic about digitalization, because normally I talk with people who don't believe that digitalization can solve the world. I think it's going to be very crucial, but there will always be limitation. And I think the crucial one is that you need a business model for local jobs and long-term sustainability. You cannot simply create a service here with the tariffs we ask in developed country and expect farmers to be able to pay for a certain service. You need to have clear local embedding, clear local capacity, transfer capacity, to be able to sustain these services. Also, we see that technology, there's so much innovation going on, but only few innovation are actually linked to a potential business model. And I think technology, if you don't have this opportunity to create a business model, you don't have innovation. You have something nice, you have something interesting, but you do need to think about cost saving, scaling, before you can actually talk about an innovation. Also, digital for development is new. People are not always aware what's possible, and they're often very afraid of what can go wrong. They're often afraid of data privacy, which is quite well covered, I think, in many African countries, but still along the route, we see different countries that have been changing their legal frameworks, halfway projects, which have been quite difficult for projects because they had to change their complete IT infrastructure to deal with these changes. And another challenge is that many of the most relevant advice, such as flood early warning, drought warning. They're often government tasks, they're public services, they're part of the mandate of different government organizations, which means it's not easy to reach out to them. You need to work throughout to a government-to-government approach. It's not the fast approach we normally like to use, like business to business. It's going to be a very long-term, very complex partnership, and that's always quite tricky because it's easy to improve it, but it's difficult to create a partnership that has the right mandate and the right minds there as well. So we see this as very relevant, but we haven't seen too much flood early warning, for example, in G4AW. Look at the challenge. The challenge looks easy: strengthening food security and access to clean water. Although from an Earth observation perspective, I also look at the areas, and there's always the link is not always equally direct. So we talk about increasing productivity, yield forecasting, but of course, increasing productivity doesn't mean increasing income. It can mean that farmers get less for the same goods. It can mean that they have even higher stocks that are being rot away. They don't reach the market. It's going to be very much to improve food security is going to be very much about taking into account the social dimension, the logistics, make sure that there's diverse and healthy diets, make sure that the transport is ready to deal with this increase, and it's going to be a more complex bundle than simply looking at the productivity of the crop on the field. Same for finding clean water. It's maybe quite possible to detect clean water, but the same we see with some other services. If you detect clean water, what's next? If you send everyone to clean water, how long will it stay clean? What do you need to consider before you start providing advice? Because with every advice might come a risk if you have too much skill and too little, for example, fresh water. And the challenge is also that you always require, from my perspective at least, a certain bundle, because Earth observation is simply part of a package to solve part of the problems of smallholders. And if you start thinking about Earth observation as being too critical, you might create too much technology without the local appreciation of this. I hope I'm still on time. I'm trying to talk fast. Some dilemmas we've seen is if you find fresh water and fresh biomass, what's next? Because if 1,000 farmers call every day and ask you where to go, is it wise to send them to the same fresh biomass, or should you already at the start taking into account spreading of these farmers? Because of course, in the first week it might not matter, but if you have 10,000 livestock you send to the same pastures, you might start creating new risk. Another one is detecting cows from space. I love the idea of detecting cows from space, although it's not easy and not going to be cheap if you want to do this in the entire Sahel. But you see a very different perspective on this. Some say, I want to know where the pastoralists are because I want to help them. I want to make sure that they're not causing conflicts. And the other ones will say, don't find out where they are, don't share where they are, because if people are aware where they're living, where they're moving, you start creating new potential risks. And these are always these different conflicting stories we're hearing. Another one is the business interest. We always say you need a business model, but what does that actually mean? Because in principle, you make money by selling something in general. So it's going to be the agri-input suppliers, the companies selling chemicals, seeds. That might not be bad, but how does it link to the idea of reducing inputs? That's something we're always talking about, discussing. Another one is open data. I think many of you will use open data. WAPOR is a great data set. We are always actively promoting use of open data because it's low cost and it's easy to create income higher than the cost in open data. But it's always difficult to find out how relevant this will be at the local context and how to deal with the continuity. Because often 3 to 5 year programs. Do you want to create the business model based on only 5 years of security, or do you want to simply spend a few years and develop for yourself something that you can control over the long term? Now, the positive thing, I think I've been a bit critical before. We have quite a few documents about our lessons we have learned, and more will be forthcoming in the next few months. I think the obvious lesson is always that users should be involved from day one, because it saves a lot of problems, like halfway changing the language, halfway adding new services because you were not well aware of the needs of the end users. And often something very important people forget is that the basic services are often the most crucial services. So with weather information, with market prices, it might not be a lot of innovation, from our, at least, perspective. But this is what people still need. This is what people can use at the day-to-day basis. This is what people will use in an app that they won't remove, because many apps are based on information that you only use like 3 times a year in the growing season, and that's not going to be a good business model, because people simply remove the app for half the year. Also, our lesson is don't focus too much on precision agriculture. It's always nice to see what we're doing here in the Netherlands and say, okay, we can also do this in many other countries, but there's simply too much a gap between the problems we are having and the problems they're having over there. It's going to be very nice, but also very difficult to create a sufficiently large target group to deal with this level of technology. And I think that there are a few very obvious services that are working well. They tick all the boxes. They help farmers. They help adapt to climate. They create business models. But these are, in principle, there are only few, like index-based insurance. The rest will always be a trade-off between a business model and other things. So, yeah, well, I'm not sure it's always equally positive, but I think we've learned a lot of very nice lessons. You can find them on our website. And I probably stay here for the next session anyway, so you can talk to me about additional questions you might have about the G4AW program and our experience. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kees, for a very interesting and certainly very useful presentation of the G4AW, what needs it covers, what are the lessons learned, and I'm sure those are also lessons learned for our participants if they do take part with the hackathon as well. I would like to ask the participants if they have any questions for our first speaker. You can raise your hand and I will make sure to unmute you, or you can put your question in the Q&A box. Perhaps we give it a couple of moments. And if there is a question for the first speaker that emerges towards the end, we will also have the chance to address it then. Because your presentation was very to the point, I can imagine that our participants need a little more time to come up with the questions, since you covered more or less every basis. If that is the case, we can move to our second speaker, and I would like to ask her to share her screen. We have with us Marie Schellens, Project Officer for GIS Applications at PACS for Peace. And we're going from space applications developed mostly within the space sector to the uses of those applications in a different setting that is not very much space related. That is also, of course, the purpose of the hackathon, to build bridges between the two. Again, without further ado, Marie, you have the floor, and do not worry much about time. Kees stayed very well within the time limit, and we always have a small buffer. In any case, what we're hearing is very interesting, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Do you see my screen correctly, or do you
Yes.
see presenter mode? Okay, great. So thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks for organizing this very nice event. I think it's great to get young people started with Earth observation data. It's getting more and more available, open source, so there's also a lot of opportunities to do great things with it. And I'll just try to give a small overview at how me and my colleagues use Earth observation data and analytics at PACS, just to give you ideas of what you might want to do in your project. A little bit about PACS. So PACS is a peace-building organization. It's the largest peace-building organization of the Netherlands, actually. And the focus of our work is really protection of civilians in conflict-affected areas. So against the acts of wars, and also in a broader sense to end armed conflict and to build inclusive peace. And so we are mainly an advocacy organization, and we aim to influence policies and peace building and justice processes on an international level, but also nationally within the Dutch government and military agents, and also on a European scale. But we also have a couple of smaller projects where we really work directly in conflict affected areas together with partner organizations there to try to have also local impacts. And my specific role within the organization is I'm actually an environmental resource, and I support the broader work on how environment, peace, and security is linked. And generally, I focus on the research of the impacts of war on the environment, and with that also the longer term toxic effects actually on the population, and trying to prevent long-term harm actually from these conflicts. So I identify and I monitor environmental damage in conflict zones, and try to reduce the impacts on the lives and livelihoods of people. Yeah, and we do research also on the wider linkages, for example, between climate crisis and conflict. So, like I mentioned, one of the key aspects that PACS works on is evidence-based advocacy. You can see a couple of the reports that we have recently worked on. And so advocacy, what we mean with that is to support a really specific cause, or to try and influence political actors or public debate. So you can also call it lobbying actually. But the important part for us is of course that it's evidence-based, so that it's based on a collection of like very rigorous evidence, very rigorous research. And we find that important, first of all, because it's really important to get a solid understanding problems are in these areas, and what are potential solutions to it. Maybe what are solutions that are being implemented already in these conflict affected areas. And it's really difficult to get good information in those areas, because a lot of people leave. Of course, you don't have like up-to-date data about what is going on in the context, and that's why we have turned to Earth observation as well, because it gives a very good kind of objective view on what is happening in remote areas that we cannot always access because of security regions. And of course, evidence is very important for us when we do advocacy or lobbying with political partners, to enhance the credibility of our of the causes that we stand for. So you can see like the evidence that we do in the first article it's really based on more traditional types of research, like surveys and interviews. But then the last three papers are really from the team that I work in, and so they have all been using Earth observation data in combination with testimonies, with interviews, with surveys. So for example, on flooding and the flooding of oil infrastructure, and that spread a lot of pollution, oil pollution in really large agricultural areas in South Sudan. Axed and Burned is about deforestation in Syria, and actually because of the war since 2011, that there has been a lot of illegal exploitation, just because people are searching for coping mechanisms. They don't have access to markets very easily anymore. They don't have like fuel prices have risen a lot, so they really have to go back to cutting down trees, even on their own olive groves, to be able to heat their homes in the winter or to cook on. And the last report is on using climate data, also observed from space, and tracking and monitoring droughts, also in Syria. So with that, I can give a bit more very specific examples of current research that hasn't been published yet, but that we're working on currently. So this is the Orontes River Basin you can see on this map. That's a river basin that flows in the west of Syria. Then you can see from general geospatial data, but also remotely sensed data, we kind of like indicated some critical water infrastructure, but also some sources of pollution in this river basin that are really leading to critical degradation of the river system and of the water resources of the population living there. So you can see in yellow dots industrial facilities that are dumping their toxic waste into the river, because there is no real governance system anymore that monitors on who is dumping what into the water. In red, for example, you have armed events, that like conflict events where specifically water infrastructure was targeted. So for example, water treatment stations or water wells or irrigation dams, but also skilled labor that works within the water management system, that they have been attacked. You have the camps of internally displaced people. This is something which is very easy to actually track from space, but not a lot of people do it. There's also ethical issues around that, similar to what Kees was mentioning about tracking the cattle from space. But there are definitely possibilities, and you can see here there's a lot of oh wait, you don't see my pointer, right? The pointer. So you can see here near the border with Turkey, there's a lot of internally displaced camps of people that are refugees within their own country, and they end up here near the border, often also next to rivers. So they're both a victim actually of a very polluted river, but also a river that has less and less water resources. But at the same time, they also contribute to further pollution because they often don't have any sanitation systems in place in those camps. So those are like kind of an example of main causes of like degradation of the water system in Syria, and how we try to research that remotely. Other examples from this research part is like the drying up of reservoirs and of lakes compared to 10 years ago to 20 years ago. So you can see much more reservoirs and rivers are becoming temporary instead of permanent rivers, but also just a completely dry up of where they used to be surface water. And this is an example of flooding happening in one of these IDP camps. So they are on the shores of on the riverbanks actually, and very often it happens. I mean, flooding is quite normal event. Actually, we know it will only happen more and more with climate change, but because of problems with the water infrastructure, because of the earthquake that happened in the beginning of the year, but also years of bombardment, both by Russian and by Assad regime, and also a lack of maintenance during the past 10 years of war. A lot of this kind of protective infrastructure, the dams that protect against the floods, have been damaged, and they can break. And then if you have all these IDP camps next to the river, where people are already those people are already extremely vulnerable because they left their home, they don't have anything anymore, and then they have to flee again because the refugee camp gets flooded. Another example, and for example, what we can also do from space is look at gravimetric measurements of like how heavy the Earth is at different times in specific locations, and that actually gives an idea of how much groundwater there is in those areas. So it's on very large resolutions, but for example, for this whole region, we do have one pixel that gives us information about how much groundwater, how much the groundwater is actually changing, and you can see a clear decrease in the groundwater levels since 2012, more or less. So those are a lot of things that we have been able to kind of like find information about in this river basin remotely. Another example that we work on a lot is Ukraine. Specifically, we worked on use of explosive weapons in urban areas, in populated areas, but then also around industries and around the environmental impacts of people living there, and the bombardment of like toxic facilities. So I can give a quick example of Hostomel, which is here really close to Kiev. It was attacked very early on in the war, the first days, because they came from the north and they tried to capture Kiev as soon as possible. But also I'll give an example of Bakhmut, which is now on the front line actually. And there's been a lot of heavy fighting. So this is Hostomel, and you can see we kind of created an overview of the damage. So the damage is in the red dots, so that those are damage maps that have actually been created by UNOSAT, and they do satellite imagery analysis to see like which buildings are destroyed, are like possibly damaged. Like they can give different levels of damage per building, and then we can overlap that with information that we have about like where are industrial facilities, where are water facilities that are necessary for the civilians, where are electricity infrastructure, and so on. And you can see that, for example, here you have a lot of damage around the water facilities, but also around school, also like large oil depots. So they have been completely bombed and they just burn up, and all the oil also leaks in the ground. Same we did for Bakhmut. You can see much more damage even here because it's still on the front line, and then it's quite industrial town. It has a lot of industrial facilities, different types, but for example, you have metal refineries, and all of those kind of ores just leak into the ground, and the chemicals that they use. Another example which we have worked on in the past year is the explosion of the destruction of the Nova Kakhovka Dam, which was in the south of Ukraine. So we're located here in Ukraine, and here you had the dam. This is the reservoir of the dam. On the reservoir, you had a nuclear power installation that used the waters of the reservoir to cool it down. And so this one has been destroyed by the Russians, been exploded. It led to massive floods downstream, which is in light blue, and upstream it led to drainage of the whole reservoir. We should make an update actually of this map, because there was the orange area indicates how much water was drained from the reservoir, but it's much more by now. It's completely drained, and this data is from doesn't say, yeah, here 8th or 9th of June. After the destruction of the dam, but by now it's completely drained. So it kind of shows like major irrigation channels that run dry because of the emptying of the reservoir, but it also shows a lot of the nature reserves area, for example, in the area that have been completely impacted, for which a lot of the species can just not survive because it's a major ecological change. And it indicates some of the major cities that are around the area. So, for example, Odessa here has received a lot of debris from the cities and the towns that were downstream, the floods that were completely destroyed. And so the flow of debris went all the way in the water into the Black Sea and has landed on a lot of the shores of Odessa. And I can zoom in a little bit on the downstream area. So then we mapped kind of like which is the residential areas in orange that have been flooded, but in yellow also industrial facilities with potential toxic elements stored there. And in red we have the Russian military equipment that was positioned there. So that has also all been flooded away and creates a lot of like leakage of toxics into the environment. And that's it for some of the examples that I want to show. Now the options are kind of limitless for this kind of research. So I just want to give you some ideas that you could possibly work on. So we have 2 projects that we're very specifically thinking of working on in the short term. And one is on oil pollution from war and from destruction of oil infrastructure in the governorate of Deir ez-Zor in Syria. And another one is the war impacts on coastal ecosystems, and with that also coastal livelihoods in Yemen. But other thematics that you can think of and that we could like maybe help you support on, or that we would be very interested in working together on or learn about is droughts, floods, illegal resource exploitation, IDP camps, like I mentioned before. Water and soil pollution can be from munition use, but can also be from mismanagement during wartime. Damage to residential areas, damage to toxic facilities, damage to critical infrastructure. And the conflict-affected regions that we work most with, that we have a bit of expertise on within our organization, are Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, South Sudan, Gaza, the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Iraq. But there's much more other areas that also deserve attention. And then just to give a short information about where you can start to find some of this open source data. You have Sentinel Hub, which is mainly data from the EU, Google Earth Engine, which gathers a lot of open source data, UNOSAT data products, and the NASA data portals. And with that, I would like to say thank you for listening and being here, and hopefully joining the hackathon. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or you can reach out to my email address.
Thank you very much for another very useful presentation, this time from a more technical perspective, focusing on the solutions, the factors, that affect landscapes in different regions of the world, and of course the consequent problems. I would like to ask our audience whether they have any questions for the second speaker, or maybe whether in the meantime they came up with a question for the first speaker. If so, please feel free to use the Q&A function or raise your hand, and once we see it, we will give you the floor. Because they were both very informative, I could understand that you really ticked all the boxes of questions that someone may have come with during this webinar. So I see why everyone is left quite satisfied, I would say. But we give it perhaps a few more seconds to see if there are any questions, already something coming up. Do we get a recording of the webinar? That is for none of our speakers. I am not aware, but I don't think this is an option. We can ask the central team and come back to you, but I'm not sure whether a recording of the webinar would be available. I stand corrected. Actually, the recording will be available for those that have registered for the webinar, so you can follow back on that. Because really, both speakers included a very good amount of information with a lot of links and a lot of references. So certainly useful to come back to that. We will have chance for more Q&As during our networking session toward the end. While I give ourselves some time to think about such questions, I would also like to present the CASSINI Entrepreneurship Initiative in general and share another set of slides with you in case you have not already had enough of them. But the CASSINI Hackathon is part of this entrepreneurship initiative. Let me play it here so we can have it full screen. So the Entrepreneurship Initiative is something that is running through the years 2021 to 2027. It's an initiative that has been put forward by the EU Agency for the Space Program, EUSPA. And the main incentive is to promote space activities, and especially new space activities in Europe. This presentation includes a lot of information. I will not go through all of them. I just wanted to bring a couple of slides to your attention because some of them may be interesting for you in preparation for the hackathon, after the hackathon, especially if you come up with a good idea, and later on if you develop, of course, something interesting. You can see here all the specific efforts that have been put forward in terms of investment, matchmaking, innovation competition, business growth, and so on. Few more details about each one of them. The Business Accelerator, some companies have already been selected for the first and the second batch. The third batch, you may want to write it down, is coming in April 2024. It's a 6-month program, and it's helping businesses or interesting creative ideas to commercialize and make their product a solution. The matchmaking effort is organized on the side of space-related events. Some of them are still to be organized toward the end of October, in the beginning of November. You see here some of the events. So if you're attending them, or if you were wondering whether to attend them, you can profit from the matchmaking events that are going to take place there. The investment facility and some startups that have raised funds along with the debt-based financing are some opportunities, some alternatives to fund ideas under this scheme. The Helios Space Stock Index is an area that provides specific information about European companies in the space sector, and then you may find interesting information about the company size, and the company growth of some of the companies that have been promoted under the CASSINI Entrepreneurship or are already active in the space sector. Of course, the hackathon, this is the 6th edition. There have been another 5 focusing on different areas. And in the CASSINI Hackathon website, you can find not only the winners, but also the solutions that they have come up with to get more ideas and see how they have been developed after the hackathon. And some other prizes, unfortunately, those ones have been closed for the time being, but you can keep going to the website and see when the next opportunities are. And the same also for the USPA Academy, that is a set of online resources, courses, and other material. On some of the areas that you see here, creating your business plan, accessing financing, navigating data policies, and so on, you can check all those resources online. And if you see that some courses have been completed for now, you can definitely go back there in a couple of weeks or a couple of months for the new round of opportunities. I'm going to leave this slide here in case you would like to quickly take a screenshot. We will make sure that you receive at least those slides so you can go back to those resources. They all have to do with various efforts under the CASSINI Entrepreneurship Initiative. And with that, I will stop sharing the screen so we can go back to our discussion between the keynote speakers and the audience, and check in the meantime here whether we have another question. If not, we can start with some of the questions that the panelists had in mind, and some questions that I had in mind to facilitate a bit our discussion with the panelists. So one more time, a call for the audience to see if they have a question. Please feel free to put it in the box or raise your hand. Having heard from our panelists, is there anyone here that has come up with an idea already for the hackathon that would like to share and maybe match it with someone else attending the webinar and come up with a team for that, or something? An innovative approach that came to your mind attending this webinar? That is a question for the attendees. And while you're thinking about it, perhaps our panelists can share their perspective, being from a business aspect, from a technical aspect, a societal aspect, another aspect, of what is a priority or a gap that exists in space solutions that address food and water security. Is there an area that has been sufficiently addressed? Is there an area that has not been sufficiently addressed and should draw more attention? Perhaps an advice for the participants where to focus their ideas on. And please, of course, unmute yourselves and take the floor. Thank you.
You go,
Can
Kees.
you can go, Marie.
Okay, yeah, I just, what comes to mind directly for me is groundwater, as we work a lot on water issues and groundwater. There are some space missions there's one space mission that captures this kind of groundwater, and it's of course difficult to do it from space because it's not at the surface. It cannot be optically detected, so it needs to be detected with other kinds of measurement systems. And so there's this one system that does it well. It's called the GRACE mission. It has satellites that measure the changes in gravity of the planet, and then knows how much there's a change of water in the ground. But that's very high, very low resolution, so on very big scale, and it's not very useful in a local context. Well, this is actually information that is not gathered very systematically all over the world, so it would be great to have some technology that kind of reduces that resolution and provides more information on that, I think. But that's the first thing that comes to mind. Maybe there's more coming later.
From my perspective, I think, by the way, I think one of my colleagues, I think, worked on this GRACE mission, so it's very interesting. I think there are new plans, but indeed, this is like a very, very coarse information. But it always triggers it's crazy, the idea of having satellites measuring the difference in gravity. it's a nice inspiration for everyone. For me, I think looking at agriculture, there's always a bias towards crops that have been crucial in the Green Revolution, because these crops have been there, studied since the 70s. We know everything about rice, maize, wheat, these crops. And it means that remote sensing has always been biased towards this crop as well, because it's easier to create crop models if you have all the parameters already ready for the past few decades. So it always remains a debate. What can we measure when it comes to more diverse cropping system in Africa? Cropping systems that are not optimized, that are have intercropping, that have rotation over year. How can we use multi-year cropping patterns to say anything about soil use? Because we always try to measure soil carbon, but probably the most obvious way to measure soil carbon is to measure the crops people grow, because if you cultivate maize 5 years in a row, it is unlikely your soil will be healthy after 5 years. Many of these things, like time series, like ecology, these are not taken into account. People generally look at what's going on now, the past year, and what can we say about that. And looking at the past will give us much more information. Also, what might be better options moving forward. That's one thing, and also the obvious one is the role of Earth observation in monitoring evaluation. How can you supplement the social data with Earth observation data to actually measure the impact of different projects? That's still a gap, because the remote sensing people will say everything is possible. The social people will say, well, people are not pixels, and you end up somewhere same with agroecology. This generally it's different kind of mindset, social versus technical. Although everyone working on technical is also partly social and other way around. But these are the ongoing discussions that are not really moving forward. I think that's so Earth observation for agroecology and Earth observation for monitoring. Well, that's quickly what I come up with now. And also logistics. It's always about measuring the fields, but not measuring the transport towards the market, because you can cultivate all the crops you want, but if you cannot get tomatoes to the market, they'll still be too expensive to eat. So that's something we always see in projects.
Yeah, and I could add to the kind of distinction between monitoring on the ground or like ground information, which can also be more qualitative and give very different kind of information versus the remote sensing. Like for us, the remote sensing is the easy one to access, and then the on the ground is really difficult. So it's also for us difficult to do ground truthing of our outcomes, and we need to always put very big disclaimers on it. Like we haven't been able to test these outcomes because they're not like we don't have any people in those areas. Sometimes we do work with partner institutes, but it's often like very risky for those people to collaborate on this type of research. So yeah, for us that's still a big challenge to like kind of validate our remote sensing work from conflict areas. So it's a bit the other way around. Like we need validation on the ground, while Kees was mentioning that the information that comes from the ground could be validated with space. So always this combination of both is really good, and is something you should try to keep in mind when you ever work on remote sensing projects later on. And then I think one challenge that we would struggle with as well, which has already been mentioned shortly, is these ethics. Like, should we try to monitor everything we could from space, like the number of cattle and where are they moving and how many are there, but also in informal settlements, like where are people living, where are they moving? It could also be used by, that's the simplest argument, could be used by militia, for example, that want to target those specific areas. But there's also just privacy reasons, like because we can doesn't mean we should actually like monitor and put a number on everything. So those are kind of like more the ethical discussions that should be thought around, that I'm not an expert in, but maybe some people have an interest in that.
Since we do not have any specific questions for now from our attendants, perhaps I can follow up with another question for both of you, because you both mentioned in your presentation some burdens, mostly practical burdens that are faced. For example, local communities being wary about certain technologies that are being used, whether they are privacy concerned, for example, or some burdens that are a bit more technical. Do I use the correct data? Do I have the available data for a certain solution? And are there other burdens that you face in your applications, or maybe in other applications that you have in mind, things that someone should consider addressing, or things that someone may come across while developing a specific solution?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is also something that Kees already mentioned. Oh, sorry, maybe there was a delay. Okay. It was about availability of data, whether it's open source and whether it's like shared by governmental institutes, data providers. Actually, we're never really sure how long we will have access to that kind of data. It's great that governmental agencies do put this data online, and I do trust that that's gonna stay available a bit more than commercial entities. But often commercial entities also provide the data for free if it is with a non-profit cost. So from the moment there is some kind of business and profit in concerned with the use of that data, you do also need to start paying for the data availability, which might also mean there is sustainability. But then you need to take that into your financial planning and so on. But the thing is, like, I think the biggest burden there is you'll always, of course, be dependent on the data providers of the raw data. So look and what their plans are and for how long the satellite will be in the air, or the information that they are providing.
I think for me, one thing is that what I've seen quite often is that people start developing projects and they think let's make a product that will be very valid in 3 years. So let's see what the projections are for smartphone use, for nutrient availability, for irrigation. And they say, okay, the baseline shows that only 10% have access to nutrients, whatever. But according to the national statistics, according to the reports, this will grow by 100%. So we should already take into account this growth. And in nearly all these cases, the project ended by saying, okay, we overestimated all the reports, and actually it's much worse than the government statistics, much worse than this. So if people say, okay, according to a GSMA report, all farmers will have a smartphone in 5 years, that hardly ever happens. It's difficult to filter out. Things make sense from the starting point. You get a report and say, okay, all farmers can irrigate, because we talked to 5 farmers and they say they can irrigate. And there's always a bias in this data. You always find the people you want to hear from, and after a year and going more in the field, you realize that these 5 farmers might be the only 5 farmers that can irrigate, and you create services based on a misconception of the actual relevance, and that's the issue. You start with reading some papers, talking to the people that are relevant for your service, but you don't understand the complete context. And especially when it comes to the uptake of internet, there we always see that this is going to be a very drastic change in the way you create a service, because if you anticipate everyone has internet and a smartphone, and after 2 years you find out this is not the case, it's going to be more different in every perspective, and more costly and less target group, and in many cases this is a complete it can be the end of a project. So yeah, that's some perspective from my side.
Thank you very much. I see a question in the chat. I'm not sure it's visible to everyone. For someone who does not have experience in the space sector or with space data, how can they get involved? Is there a trick? Is there something useful to know? Because for someone, maybe you have seen this also when you're developing your applications and you would like to offer them to users. For someone who's not very familiar with the space sector and space data being part of that sector, either they think they lack the knowledge, or they're wary because this data comes from space, so there must be something unique about them. How do you see the involvement from someone with non-space background, with space data?
Good question. I think I know of some initiatives online which are quite easy to use, like the ones I mentioned in my PowerPoint, but there's more, which is kind of like platforms that try to gather this kind of space data and distribute it in a more easy way. You would need to know a little bit about like how to use user interfaces, but if you can work with like Google Maps, you should be able to work with those things. And for example, you have Earth Map, which is developed by FAO, which gathers a lot of different types of environmental indices gathered from Earth observation. And then if you want to go a bit deeper, you can go into like Sentinel Hub that gives you more of the raw data, but also already some kind of processing of the data that will show you different ways of how to use the data, and just follow their guidelines. And they all have like starter guides. Just try to play around on those platforms, and once you feel secure, you can also start downloading the platform and do your own processing on it. But often these kind of general platforms do have good user guidelines and starting guidelines for people that have never used it. And then if you're interested in a specific topic, you often find things as well, like GIS in conflict affected areas, or also check out the bigger institutes, the bigger like UNOSAT. They often have like summer workshops to try and train people in their expertise. So yeah, check out those organizations that I've mentioned during my intervention.
Some input from Kees, if you would like.
Well, yeah, I don't think space data is unique as it comes from space. I think most people can, after a while, realize if you can see it outside, many things you can see satellite. You can't really see unemployment satellites because you might because you get people in the marketplace with gray hair or whatever. Some things are unique for space data, like the gravity measurements or radar, like soil submergence. But yeah, this is like a niche. In many cases, you can measure simply changes. Well, you can understand a change can be relevant. So it's more important to understand what could be relevant as an indicator, and after that you can discuss. Okay, I think this would be a very relevant indicator. Is this one that we can measure? Instead of starting, okay, we can measure this. How can we make this relevant? So these are two sides. I don't think you need to work with data. I think there's always going to be people who can work with data. And I think it should be refreshing from many perspectives because it's much more out of the box. It might end up in some crazy questions like, can I detect gold with satellite data? Even had a talk about this morning. But that's all part of the refreshing outside attitude I think we need in the space sector.
Very good points, both of them. Perhaps we can move to some closing remarks and open the floor to a networking or at least an unofficial discussion setting. For that, for the attendees that are still with us, I will make sure that you are allowed to participate in that. What we heard from both presentations are the many facets of food and water security and the many ways in which space data can find an application. Some of them are rather obvious, some of them are quite sophisticated and elaborated applications. The example of the G4W for AW of NSO is a good example of how that can work in different communities around the world, addressing their specific needs, but also understanding some challenges that are present in different areas around the world. Kees also highlighted the importance of having a business model when developing such a type of an application, and the need to take into account some local factors. What we've heard from the second speaker was more of a technical and very useful input on creating such solutions, the type of information that you are using to create a product that gives you another set of information with which you can really create very meaningful insights and tackle specific problems taking once again into account the needs of a certain landscape. And you gave us examples from areas around the world that are really, really different. And you also hinted to other opportunities for other areas to be looked at, which proves that once you have an understanding of how this data works, giving also the example of many open source data, such as, to name but a few that you referred to, Sentinel Hub, Google Earth, and so on. So once you have a good understanding of how this data work and how you can work with this data, you can really apply your solution into very diverge perspectives. I'm sure that all of this gave to our participants some ideas for sure, help them understand some priorities, some issues they could look at. Hopefully they will participate also in the hackathon and they will turn some of the ideas we shared here today into actual solutions. With that, I would like to once again thank our two speakers, Kees van Duijvendijk from the Netherlands Space Office and Schellens from Pax for Peace, and all the attendants.